All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and jump in since we're a few minutes behind schedule, getting some mic things worked out. My name is April Donnelly. I'm with the U.S. IU's program.
And I am Josh Young. I am the program manager for the support office of the Interagency Ocean Observation Committee.
So the purpose of this town hall session is to talk a little bit more about certification standards as are required in the ICOOS Act, which is the Integrated Coastal Ocean Observation Systems Act of 2009. I'm just going to call it the ICOOS Act because that will be much easier for all of us. The ICOOS Act requires the development of certification standards by the Interagency Committee, the Interagency Ocean Observing Committee, or the IOOC. Those certification standards are to be established for non-federal entities. That includes RICEs, as are named in the Act, Regional Information Coordination Entities, which involves the regional associations, IU's regional associations, and a number of other things. And the purpose of the certification standards is to integrate those non-federal entities into the IU's system. As we sat down and took a look at that requirement, it belongs to the committee. The USIU's program has been working closely with the committee to try to tackle that requirement. It's a big piece. We wanted to go about it the best way in terms of getting community involvement. And we've been working closely with the committee since April of this year to take a good hard look at how we ought to approach meeting that requirement from a process perspective. The goal of today's session is to get your input on these two questions here as a part of that process. As I mentioned before, when we were talking about how to go about meeting the requirement, we decided to approach it in 5 phases, the first being scoping, of which this town hall is one element of that. To scope the problem, to commission working groups to sit down and draft certification criteria or standards for these non-federal entities and assets, to release those draft standards, to get additional public comment and input on what do you think about this, the standards themselves, and the process and procedure to go about being certified, to take those comments in, adjudicate them, and then to release a final. And then that will be in existence for a while until we take a look at it again. So we're in the scoping phase right now. That's the goal of this particular session. And these two these two questions here initially are what we're looking for comment on today.
Okay, I would like to briefly draw out some of the relevant portions of the ICOOS Act section on certification. The first bullet here is really the tasking to the committee. It's what our charge is. We're supposed to develop these certification standards as one of the requirements from the ICOOS Act. The next 3 deal with the goals of developing those standards. Once they're developed, they will first be used to determine if you're eligible to be integrated within IUs. A second major focus of certification is to ensure compliance with those standards after an entity has been certified. And lastly, it is to ensure sustainable regional observations. Now, within all of this, it is important to remember that when it is non-federal assets, that certainly does include coastal and ocean observing systems, but the way the Act is worded, it also includes research and development and education and outreach, specifically listed as non-federal assets. So that's something to consider throughout this process.
And also listed in that assets piece, as I mentioned before, but are these RICEs and RAs. So we're talking about things, assets, observing technologies and the like, and also organizations and people. So it's a broad definition. And I'd note also there are handouts out front that contain some more, they have the specific language in the Act as well as some definitions included as well, if that's helpful. Perhaps most importantly to call out here as well is there's a civil liability provision included in the ICOOS Act. That provision provides non-federal entities that are certified, that meet certification standards, with civil liability for issues arising from the use or dissemination of IU's data. So essentially what happens here is NOAA, as the lead federal agency, and the Department of Commerce take on liability, the possibility of liability for incidents arising from IU's data that's delivered and processed through the system from non-federal assets. So as all of you can imagine, from a legal perspective, NOAA lawyers have a a hard and fast interest in making sure that there's some real solid thought and concrete planning and thought into these certification standards.
So this is the last slide before we go on to the moderated discussion. I'd like to remind everyone that there are really two distinct areas that you're welcome to provide input into. One, the process for developing these standards through the 5 phases, and then also the actual standards themselves, the results of that process. And this is one venue for providing those comments, but there will be others. There's a Federal Register notice that will be going out shortly that will provide a written opportunity. So all of these questions are more focused on the results side as opposed to the process. Remembering the non-federal assets includes the observing system, but also education and outreach, research and development. What functions would need to be certified? How granular does it need to be? These are things that we would certainly welcome input on. The second question to consider is, how does certification play within an organization that has members? If, for example, an RA is certified, does that mean that liability protection for data goes to a member institution of the RA, like a university? Or is that data liability only offered if it's served through the RA that is certified? The third one really gets to the heart of the matter. What are the criteria for certification? There are some obvious things like data standards and protocols, but because we want certification to function as a tool to ensure sustained regional observations, we want to make sure they're stable. So how is it appropriate to ensure that? Should we look at the governance of the regional entity? Should we look at the terms of reference? Is there a business plan requirement? Things like that. Lastly, how would an entity apply for certification once the standards are issued? What would that process look like? There would probably be an application that would have to be filled out. But how would we verify that all of the relevant standards are being met? Could we use a third-party entity's standards, compliance with some existing protocols? Is that sufficient? And would it entail actual visits to the site, or can it all be done remotely? Lastly, what is the temporal time frame? Is it something that once you're certified, it's forever? Is it for a 5-year period? Or is it continuous as long as you meet all existing IU standards? But does that mean it can be revoked at any time if you're no longer compliant? And how does compliance look? We would welcome feedback on any and all of these areas. And as April pointed out, this is the very beginning of the scoping phase, so your input can have impact. And with that, I'd like to pass the microphone to David Martin.
Thank you, Josh. I'm going to use this microphone to NOAA's credit on this in their effort to memorialize the discussion and input. This is being recorded both by video and by microphone here, so I'm going to be walking around to ensure that your views, which are very important in this process that impacts all of us, can be recorded and used as as they said here, one of the initial steps in the scoping or obtaining of data necessary to form a coherent and responsible and sensible plan for accreditation. I don't have all that much more to say because your opinions are much more valuable than are mine, other than this particular venue, MTS IEEE Oceans 2010, I think was chosen as a way to kick this off based on the results of IU's interactions at Ocean 2009 in Biloxi, wherein this venue was found to be exceptionally productive in a way to, in fact, begin the solicitation of the opinions and thoughts of this vibrant community that we all own. So with that, are there any thoughts initially from people here? You're going to have to follow me around as I try to get people to participate here.
Morning, Ray Toll. Sorry I was a little bit late. Did you cover it all? I mean, there's a few of us in the room that have been engaged in the IUS community in the regions for quite some time. So the certification discussion I got involved in back in 2004-05, how much of that are you rolling up? I mean, how much of the history that we've, in the discussions of certification, are you able to use?
Yeah, I can take a crack at answering that. I think I didn't go into a lot of details, but initially I mentioned that the Interagency Committee and the IUS program have been working together on this subgroup. Largely the focus there has been, as I mentioned, sort of how do we go about tackling this requirement and making sure that we're proceeding in, along a good process, I guess, essentially. And in looking at that, one of in those phases that I mentioned, one of the things we've been talking about, as Dave just mentioned, is not interested in recreating the wheel. There has been a lot of thought and legitimate discussion and sort of a lot of good brain power put into this issue in the past. And so we think that that shouldn't, well, my opinion, I think everybody's don't want that to sort of be set by the wayside and people recreate the wheel there. So what we've done initially as a part of the process is come up with the idea of chartering working groups focused on developing certification criteria, the stuff that we're looking for feedback on here, for data partners, focused on the data side of things, and also on regional, the RICEs, the Regional Information Coordination Entities. And in those charters that we've put together for those working groups, we've included specifically in their guidance that they need to look at and take into consideration the body of work that was put together through the IUS development plan, through discussions, pretty much any paper I've been able to get my hands on in that sort of the history of the conversation, that is required reading material and for consideration. Does that answer your question, Ray?
Yeah, Josie Quintrell on NEFRA, the National Federation of Regional Associations, not RICEs. I think you can call us RAs because actually the law does refer to us. So, a couple of questions. One, who are these working groups, and who would be involved in that? Is just federals, or is it?
So it's a very relevant question, and it's something that anyone is welcome to provide input on who should be involved. But as we tried to point out early on, this is the very first phase. It's scoping. We are seeking comments on the process. The second phase, once the community has provided input, is to actually define the process. We do expect there to be working groups, and there is a charter for an initial data or RICE one. But the actual means of going through the process is still open to revision. So I think everyone is interested in having regional participation. The exact form is still something open for development. Does that somewhat? Why don't you explain the whole process? So it's 5 phases, and the first phase is scoping. This is part of that. The Federal Register notice will also be part of that, and it's an opportunity for the community to provide input on how these standards should be developed, and also the results of what the standards should look like. So we're just in scoping. The second stage will be drafting, and that will include the process for developing the standards, as well as the initial proposed standards. So in the second stage, once that's completed, there will be an exact format for developing all of this stuff. The third will be the public release of the proposed standards. Fourth will be adjudication of any comments that have been submitted on the proposed standards. And then fifth would be a final release.
I think, too, if this is helpful, what I heard you ask about who are these working groups, I think what we've done, the subgroup, the program and the IOC has suggested, we've built sort of a general, there'll be a working group for data partners, and that should include a federal data representative. It should include, it has categories as opposed to specific named individuals. That charter's been sent to the interagency committee for approval. So they've been looking at it. I couldn't tell you right now who the 8, 5, 7 people are going to be names wise. They will have to be federal employees. Because of we get into issues with the Federal Advisory Committee Act. So we were a little bit tied in that respect. The hope was that through the scoping phase, we'd like to come up with as much sort of data and input as we can from the community through sessions like this, the Federal Register notice, individual meetings, and that type of thing, so that when that group is established, then we can sort of hand them that body of comments along with their charter, which includes things like I referenced with regards to Ray's question about past work, sort of hand them a body of work and say, now you guys are responsible within a set time frame for drafting, as Josh mentioned, the standards themselves and the means by which an entity would go about getting certified. Does that help? Right now, I don't have names. The IOC isn't there yet.
Dave Jones, APL UW. Will there be some balance between what the standards require and what the funding is allowed to let them do? I mean, I imagine there could be a lot of mandates that are unfunded.
That's a really good question, and that's something we'd welcome your thoughts on. We've done a lot of discussing of things just like that. What does that mean? What does that look like over time? I can't tell you honestly that I have an opinion on that yet. I don't know that our group has sort of gotten into the meat of that piece. That would be a question that would most certainly be on tap for this working group, the Data Partners Working Group or the Rice RA Working Group to take a look at and to figure out, we're suggesting this, and here's what the implications or consequences of that decision might look like. So I thank you for bringing it up. That's exactly the kind of thing that if there are opinions in this room about that particular issue or other things, we'd welcome them. The more the better in my perspective, and I think from the working groups too, when that group comes together.
When you come up with your list of the things that the RAs have to do, the RA should come up with what their expected cost is, so you can balance those two things. And you may have some standards that aren't that important, but they could be very costly to an RA. One of the things I'm thinking of is 24/7 operations. Do we have to maintain a watch? Because there's big implication on people for that. There may be other ways around that.
Thanks. I have a bunch of questions, so I'll try not to. One of the things when the RAs have been sort of talking about certification, we haven't done it for a while, but based on the things that have come before, the requirements of the Act, because there's other language in the Act besides what you've posted that actually makes it a little bit confusing, but in that way it opens up, I think, some opportunities. And one of the things we've been thinking about is that you could divide, and I think you may be doing this by setting up your working groups, between certifying an entity such as an RA, which is, in my understanding of why one of the reasons the RAs were created, was a venue to bring in non-federal assets into the federal system. And so if we use them as the venue for that, that gives you some sort of manageable, reasonable structure. And both in the legislation and the IU's plan, it talks about they have to have a governance structure, they have to have a strategic operating plan. And all the RAs have been working under that. That's the assumption that they've needed to do for certification way before the Act ever was passed, and that's sort of the guidance that's been going on. And then the data standards would be separate and different, and maybe we would come up with terms that wouldn't, maybe the RAs would be accredited or the RICEs would be accredited and the data would be certified, because that's an ongoing process. As data comes along, that's going to be ongoing and growing. You want to keep that current, you want to keep that up to the best standards, and that may be a separate thing where the accreditation of the entity might be something separate. And I guess my question is that what you're thinking? It sounds like with the two working groups, you might be thinking along that lines?
I would point out that, they are definitely distinct areas of expertise, and that was our thought process, was that the people who would be able to provide guidance on what should be considered for governance are probably not the same people who would be able to provide guidance on data. As far as the outcomes, you know, that's not what this group is focused on. We're certainly not the experts in drafting those kind of standards for either governance or data. We've talked about all of these things, but we're not the decision-making body in any way. So, you know, we recognize what you're drawing out, but that'll be up to that data group or RICE group to make a recommendation on. Does that make sense?
Hi, I'm Mark Bushnell. I've been involved with the Quality Assurance of Real-Time Oceanographic Data Group, and we started thinking that we would take on the quality control of current measurements. And in short order, we discovered that in one fell swoop, you can't do quality assurance of all currents. You have to focus. We wound up on an individual sensor, an individual model, really narrowed it down. And I think it's almost cost prohibitive, as you pointed out, to do each individual sensor. And so I'd suggest that you certify an entity to handle an observatory using best practices for putting instruments in the water. And an alternative to that would be if that RA mimics a federal asset exactly. In the case of co-ops, if you deploy a water level sensor that is exactly the same as what co-ops deploys, that could be an easy way to certify an individual sensor.
That's the kind of comment I think is helpful. And so essentially what you're saying is use something, if there's a standard in existence for a group, like if co-ops is using a particular standard and sensors are similar, adopt that potentially. It's good, helpful. Thank you.
My name is Kelly Page. I'm with the Great Lakes Observing System. I was just curious how this relates to the IUCE Regional Maturity Index that we've all seen drafted and passed around.
Sorry, had to wait for the on light to come on. Well, I can tell you essentially that the maturity index has largely been, and I'm not working on that directly in the program, so this is my layperson's opinion. I might defer to a couple of people in the audience if they have a better sense, but essentially the maturity index will be used from a metrics perspective in terms of how do we measure performance, I think, and with regard to needing to meet needing to be able to answer questions on up the chain from a budgetary type perspective. How do we demonstrate that IUCE from a regional perspective is providing, doing what we want them to do and what they are doing and what we're saying they're gonna do with regards to funding, future funding. I don't think we're, or at least I'm not right now, tying these two together. At one point there was some discussion on that piece. At this point we're in just sort of this initial discussion on certifying the entities. What does that mean? And trying to gather input on that. I don't know if that's a very helpful answer to your question, but I think that's where we are right now. Carl, did you want to add?
Hi, my name is Carl Goldman. I'm also in the IUCE program, and I work on performance evaluation and tracking. And I think another piece of that that's key that April might not have thought of is that there's elements in that regional maturity index that are very much related to the governance standards that were talked about, that Ray asked about from 5 years ago. So the elements in there that talk about being a viable entity that's able to receive money and execute funds and operate an array of an observing system, those elements would be taken on by the group, you know, as background materials to consider and to use. So we're not reinventing the wheel, because we've gone over some ways that we could try to measure viability of an entity to be operating a regional coastal ocean observing system. So those elements we would fold into the working group.
Dick Crowd at NOAA's National Data Buoy Center. I mean, I think that's probably where we want to go with this. And I think it's along the right lines. You know, we definitely have some ideas on the data side of things, how we think maybe things should be aligned. But you know, that's something that I don't think is for this group. I think that's for whenever they put the data group together, would probably be a good thing, you know, to put those things out. The CORTOD has done a fair amount of work. There have been 4 or 5 of those now, and there are some, while they're not standards, I think what we've realized is there are different levels that people can do. And again, I think that's something that would be good that goes into when the data group gets together, is to look at things like that. Looking at the at the IUs, the regional associations themselves. I've been lucky to be a part of watching several of them grow. I actually have a slide in one of my presentations that shows the birth of IUs as the birth of the United States, the writing of the Constitution. And I don't think it's totally unlike that from what I've seen. But I think we've made a lot of progress, and but I agree that, and I think we can come out of that from today's meeting.
My comments are probably a little more general than the first question that's up there, but as you know, I've worked hard to try to get money for this outfit and get it going, and so I'm still engaged in that concept. I think this is an important part of where we need to go for the future for the ocean community and for environmental sustainability. So if you're going to get things certified, I think that they need to be certified in accordance with whatever federal standards there are. For then you can do it on instrument basis, you can do it on systems basis, you can move around. But the idea is that if people are going to think of coastal ocean observing and ocean observing systems that are managed in the regional associations or not federal assets, and they're going to think of them as something that really is important for the nation, they need to meet the standards that the nation requires, because that way you can come in and say, hey, we have a system that's absolutely essential for weather forecasting. We have a system that's absolutely essential for safety or rescue or whatever. So putting those things in a way, so look at the systems and the sensors that you're trying to advertise. If you have a system, HF radars. I mean, that to me is a national system. Lots of people use it, so let's get the feds to agree that that's a national system. It's certified, it's got all the right characteristics to have it provide the kind of data that makes sense to give out to the community and to people to make forecasts and public good. So anyway, I think whatever certification you pick on, do it to federal standards so that we have a way to leverage ourselves in terms of funding.
Anybody else on this topic? This is really central to what we're doing. Mark?
I've got a slightly different slant. I'm fascinated by Weather Underground, and I see it popping up more and more people when they need weather observations for their particular project. We'll just go to Weather Underground, and they don't care whether it's certified or National Weather Service facility. It's data in their backyard where they need it. And one of the first things to come out of CORTIDE was that every observation should be associated with a quality indicator. Is it a good observation? How good is it? So one of the considerations for standardization might be, as long as the entity says this is a bad current measurement and it has large error bars, but here it is very convenient for you, that might well be adequate.
Well, give you a second. I've been involved with IUs for a scary number of years, and one of the first things we did was this whole idea of, for data at least, there's some caveat emptor in there if you have lots of different folks that are putting out data. So there is, in fact, that aspect.
Hi, I'm Janet Fredericks from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and working on bringing the recommendations from CORTIDE into web services. And so I think a lot has changed since 2004. I think that we're still down in the weeds in the ability to do it, but I think Mark's point is doable nowadays. I think we can, what the government could do is sort of specify what you want to know about it, not necessarily what the error bars are, but what information you need. Like, you need a calibration date, you need a calibration expiration date, sort of in broad terms how one might assess the data, not putting an axe on it. So I think we're there, or pretty close to being there, in the ability to deliver that information.
Really is central to what we're all here for. This is really excellent points by everybody. Is there anything further on this? Oh, Ray, yes, hold on.
Ray Toll again. I'm on the GCU's board. I failed to say that earlier. Is there a clear definition, April, Josh, in your, when you say non-federal assets? And on the GCU's board, we've got these 10 subsystems, of which, I don't know, a third a part of the federal enterprise, if you will. And of course, NDBC has been an incredible partner in all 11, I would say, but certainly with GCOOS and the oil and gas and minerals management. And so we still have this family of 18 federal partners that are trying to, well, I don't know how, we're still hoping that they're going to engage with us, but with NOAA's leadership, with your leadership, obviously there's hope. But I'm just curious, do you have a clear-cut guidance for the working groups about how do you define a non-federal asset?
Yes, Ray, I do. And I'm pulling it straight from the act. So, and you have to, I'm happy to just read this one out, but bear with me a little bit because it's broad. How about that? So in the ICUS Act, non-federal asset is defined. It says the term non-federal assets means all relevant coastal and ocean observation technologies, related basic and applied technology research and development, and public education and outreach programs that are integrated into the system and managed through the states, regional organizations, universities, NGOs, or the private sector. So, and in addition, RAs as RICEs are considered non-federal assets. That's defined in another place in the Act. But as you can tell from that definition, it's broad, and just to throw that out there, I don't know how you certify R&D. And if any of you have an answer to that question, we would welcome that. But these are, as we read the definitions and started looking through the Act, and granted, this was, I can say this, right? It was sausage making sort of at its finest here. So what we've got here is what we've got. But as we started to look through what's in the statute, how did Congress define it? It's broad and not exactly cut and dried. As Josie mentioned earlier, it's kind of, there are different references to things in different places. And
yeah, I would just like to point out that we've had a good bit of conversation on this particular point. There is a very broad definition, but there are still some questions that arise from it. Yeah, I think it comes down to title, but if a federal agency retains title on, say, the data that a system is producing, but not the actual observation system, how do you go about certifying that when it's not consistent? Parts of it are federal and parts of it aren't. This is something that, input would certainly help.
Hi, I'm Robert Varley from Lockheed, perhaps with an industry perspective. Actually, I want to ask if my situation even applies here. I think it does. We're seeking to look at ocean thermal energy as a resource for power generation. And in doing so, we will have platforms on the water, initially small numbers, but as the technology matures, there'll be large numbers. We already know we need to do massive amounts of environmental measurements to determine or to help satisfy the actions of our plant aren't harming the environment. Those measurements can be, in my mind, valuable to this organization in terms of being available. And so when I listen to the discussion going on here, I am, of course, concerned about cost and the ability to be able to maintain that data flow and the quality of that data flow. So question number one is my situation relevant to this gathering? And then two, I'm very interested in understanding the types of data and what constraints you put on in terms of its connectivity.
Some of that, your role is very relevant. It is included, the industry is a key player. Any non-federal asset would need certification at some level, so that would still apply to industry. Things that are still to be decided is how you would go about doing that. If you're serving your data to a RA and that RA is certified, it could be that's it. Those are things that, we're looking for input on.
I think that would be my response.
Jack Harlan, NOAA IU's program. I just wanted to make a comment that something that's going on in the Weather Service right now is the transitioning from research to operations of the MADIS system, MADIS, and they have thousands and thousands of non-federal assets that are incorporated into MADIS every day. So there might be a pathway there to look at. I mean, they are definitely underway. I think they're doing IOC this Friday. So just a suggestion to
and I could make some connections for you there.
I'm going to go back to the definition of non-federal assets, and I think the key word in that definition in the legislation is managed. So I think there's a lot of federal money that is somehow involved in a lot of the observing assets that are out there, whether it's from NOAA, NSF, ONR, other sources. But I think there's a distinction between NDBC contracting with SAIC to run their buoy program and somebody receiving federal money and managing that asset. And I don't know how you would ever certify education or R&D, but the other parts I think you might have a chance at.
I'll get to you in just a second. I think a way to approach this whole idea of the need for certification of S&T programs or education and outreach programs would be if our group consensus here is that the RAs are the certifiable entities, is to make sure that those have a demonstrated track record of, in fact, engaging with S&T, engaging with education and outreach as part of their overall certification process. Let me get to David Jones here.
Hi, David Jones again. Just thinking of Lockheed's situation and maybe playing devil's advocate, what incentive does, say, a non-federal asset have in being certified, unless perhaps some funding opportunities or something like that? So I hate to keep harping back to funding, but if you ask people to certify, there should be some expectation besides just goodwill.
Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind with me is that this does offer liability protection for the data in and of itself. Funding is always going to come up, and I'm not denying that, but there is some value to just the status of being certified. It provides the legitimacy that the data does have certification, and the entity is protected from liability for the data.
A follow-up comment to yours, and it really does connect into number two. Roger Poyes with the SICORA, the Southeast Regional Association, and I think to the degree possible that we can run these through the regional associations and provide that as the foundation for the certification process. And I think that's going to maximize and get to some of the comments that was just made about funding. The funding mechanisms through that, I think the intent is that the base funding exists now with the intent that that expand so that you have the opportunity to have other partners under the associations and which are bringing together those non-federal assets. I think one thing I would like to say is kind of a follow to the beginning of this, that a specific request be made to the regional associations to have formal comment on all these specific questions. I know we're in a scoping process, and I'm familiar with that very much, being in fisheries and how you go through these, but a formal request to tap in on the expertise at both the data level as the evolution of the individual associations move forward. I think it gets to a lot of these, and we can go forward beyond just the group we have here or the other scoping meetings you have. You can have their individual boards and other groups, technical groups provide, I think, a lot of foundation to go further. But getting back to the regional association, I think would be a very key opportunity to provide the mechanism to establish kind of the certification, things going through that would provide the data, would provide links to the R&D complexity as it evolves, as well as outreach and a lot of the different aspects we've been talking about.
Part of that, I think that's a great point. We've been in part of it, or in addition to the town halls, there's a Federal Register notice that I say should go out any minute, in the hopes that it should go out any minute. Today, tomorrow, it's been poised in that clearance channel place, right? Or it's just, so that'll be out there, and we'll certainly, our subgroup is certainly has every interest in making sure that folks at the RAs get that link and have nowhere to send stuff, and that you do. So I think that's one mechanism, and also trying to work with Josie and NIFRA to connect with the to connect with folks on October 6th. We have a meeting scheduled, and if you're interested in calling in, please do, because I'm hopeful SICORA will be there. I think Deborah's going to be there, but to get specific input from the RAs, just like you mentioned. So good point.
Nothing here is meant to be binding, it's not. This is a provision of information to NOAA to use. That's why we're recording this. I think we have given NOAA the group consensus on number one, which is kind of that these RAs, the last speaker certainly suggested that strongly as well, should be where the certification arrow is pointed at least initially. Number two seems to be shaping up that we're going to head towards a consensus that if number one is the RAs, should NOAA be then responsible for certifying the possible atomization of a multitude of other sub-RA-like entities, or should in fact that not be done? Should the RA be held responsible, whatever that means, for saying that things included in the RA structure are included in that certification? That seems to be what I'm hearing. If that's incorrect, then we need to have that point of view established. I don't see any shaking heads either way. So I'll use moderator privilege and say that's exactly what this group thinks. That the RAs, and then within the RAs, there need not be sub-certification. At least NOAA can take that as a point of reference. It's not binding, but that seems to be what's going on, and that could certainly be a matter of debate or lacking debate. It's passed by unanimity. 3 says what criteria should be used to evaluate non-federal assets for certification, and certainly Mark and I'm so sorry, Janet have done some excellent points on what that means from a data standpoint. The criteria then, if you're talking about RAs, that has in fact been discussed at length before, and April was kind enough to point out that certainly that body of literature, that body of appendices that have dealt with certification of RAs in the past. Do you have a business plan? Do you have a strategic plan? Do you have outreach? Do you have education? Do you have all of those things? Will certainly be included in your calculus for how you go about in this reasonable approach towards certification. And again, this is but the first step. Is there anything that people want to say on 3? So far, what we've got is, yes, we're not going to forget what parts of the wheel have been invented to this point, and we have lots to look at in that regard.
I just wanted to also offer that recently the Great Lakes had to put together a quality management plan for some EPA funds that we got through Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And I thought that process, although it was very difficult, to put that document together, really helped in the development of our business plan and some of the other supporting documents. And that it could certainly be expanded on or put into more detail in regards to best practices for deploying instrumentation, or a whole slew of related activities that RAs would be doing. So I think that might be another good reference point, is looking at the EPA's requirements for quality management systems.
Hi, yes, I'm Zizan Yan. I'm from Office of Coast Survey under the NOAA NOS. And just now, Mark said we're talking about directly the observational data, kind of the criteria for data quality control. And I know that IUS involves also a large chunk of model output. And I think IUS should also put much attention on how to produce a kind of criteria for that part, because each university, each research group could just build up their model and publish the result, and I don't think the users would dare to use those results directly. So there must be some criteria skill assessment for the model output. And just for your reference, we are at the Office of Coast Survey. We in our group, we belong to the Coastal Development Laboratory. We produce the nowcast forecast model results directly and then transfer them to the co-ops into operational mode, as what Mark indicated. And in the past 10 years also, we have been putting a lot of effort on developing the skill assessment criteria to evaluate the model result. And so my question is, you were mentioning about potentially you're going to create a kind of data criteria group, and we would certainly looking forward to be able to working with them and getting their input to improve our skill assessment criteria setup. And if it is interested in, we will certainly would like to kind of make our own contribution for that part. Thank you.
If I can real quick, Dave. That's good to know. Like I mentioned before, we have slots on this working group that are slated for folks in different expertise areas for data in particular. So you may have just volunteered yourself.
This is in fact a seminal one for this group and for in fact this entire national effort from a regional standpoint. I'm going to say some scary things here, and then I'm going to get back to that excellent point you just made. The scary things, of course, is that lots of folks have different kinds of numerical models running. If we're talking about the provision of prognostic or forecast fields, let's say for waves at Long Beach, Washington, and you put out a forecast of 3 to 4 foot swell, and you're wrong based on whatever your forcing functions are, and a family from New Jersey is out on the coast and they get killed by a rogue wave, then that whole idea of litigation comes up. So in general, to this point in time, the provision of products that affect human mortality or morbidity is the state function. That's usually federal in this case. The feds don't allow themselves to be sued. And there have been mistakes by the Weather Service. It's imperfect science. So this idea about models is in fact central, and how that is done should be a very important part of how this idea of certification is approached. You might want to do some kind of a hybridization, as you just talked about. The RAs could do regionally specific model development. The provision or running of those models would go through an op-eval, op-test kind of thing that Navy does, that we're very familiar with in this community. And then that model is run by somebody else like NOAA or Navy or whoever it might be. But that's a very, very good point. Thank you for that very much. Anything else on criteria? Models is its own particular can of worms, as it were. Is there any disagreement with that? Did that make sense, or did that resonate with people? I see heads going up and down. That's nice. Okay.
One other aspect of criteria that we might think about is that, okay, we've talked about the quality of the data. We talked about the quality of the sensor. You know, you can buy the best sensor, have it deployed, and if you don't have any staff that are qualified to operate it or maintain it, then that's just another piece of the puzzle, I think, that really hasn't been talked about too much, and that might play into these criteria of certification. So, just a comment.
Thank you. And that whole idea of not only just maintaining, but the fact that that nature can be cruel, and that buoys such as NDBCs and others go for little jaunts in the Northeast Pacific from year to year as the waves hit them, or the perfect storm buoy that was just slammed, and then that opens up NOAA and National Weather to litigation because the thing is sunk or gone somewhere else. I mean, these kinds of acts of God are in fact part of that. We need to shield all the well-meaning people in this room and across the country involved in this wonderful enterprise we're in from that kind of thing. And the certification standards should certainly take into account those kinds of activities, just as they do for the National Weather Service. Thank you very much, Jack. Okay, this discussion is great. Who's next? Who has a point they want to bring up?
I meant that a lot of the thoughts that I've had, David has summed up very, very well. I guess I'm just sitting here thinking that I want to echo what the Admiral said earlier. You know, let's get this going forward. Let's do it, and instead of trying to devise the perfect process, let's get a process, let's make it very clear, and let's go forward with it. And if we need to adjust, we can adjust. But I think you've got 11 functioning RAs that are doing a lot of work. There's obvious strong merit towards the certification. Liability has been discussed, but also you know, other aspects as well. And I think there's a lot of work that's been done to previously. So I'm just an advocate for marching forward. But it's great that you're getting our input. So I thank you for that.
I had a question on this model certification, because Stenka, you may know this, but in the Gulf of Mexico oil spill, where there was using some RA model outputs, I mean, those weren't certified, but they proved to be useful because people understood, you know, what they did well, what they didn't well. They looked at them on a sort of an ensemble basis. And so I feel like there's going to be a tension as opposed to getting information out there and then kind of having it certified. And there's going to be times when quote unquote non-certified information might be indeed very useful, like it was in the oil response.
So, Stanka Willis, Director, IUCE. Yeah, I think that as we go through this, first and foremost, the certification is really tied to the liability, and that's the use of the data. At this point, there's still the human in the loop. I mean, NOAA's Office of Response and Restoration, who had the responsibility to do this trajectory, is using all sources. The Hurricane Center uses, all sources of information, and there's still that human. So I don't think that this process is going to change that. I think what this process is going to do is kind of clarify when and where we need to put those standards. And it should not be confused with if we're going to take a research and development model and transition it into operational use. That process is different and distinct from this certification, and something we're looking at through the modeling test bed in working that test bed aspect of the non-federal partnership into NOAA, USGS, Army Corps, and Navy operational models. So I think that you're going to see.
Hi, Landry Bernard. I guess I've been sitting there for quite a while, and I was trying to think of, well, David's been grading all the comments, so I'm not going to grade mine, but he will. So I'll be one of the ones that wants in a good comment. But anyway, I was just trying to put this together, and I'm thinking to myself, okay, in the early days, we had the federal backbone, and we had, the regional associations. And so when I think of the federal backbone, and the federal backbone does have a certain capacity. So I don't view this as a way to grow the federal backbone, but nor do I view this as a way to just grow regional organizations. And to me, I think it kind of goes back to maybe just the early documentations where I said, okay, what's inherently government and then what's not inherently government. So when I think of the Weather Service, I mean, to me, safety of life is important. 24/7 is important. Be able to run, having backups and whatever it takes so that you can produce those forecasts. And some of them are going to be wrong. Hopefully, the majority of them are right, but there are going to be things when things go bad. So if I view that as like the Weather Service as an inherently government, that doesn't mean every observation they use, has to be inherently government. So you bring in observations from other activities. The whole idea with the quality of the flags, it goes back to, buyer beware. Use the data, and if you use it prudently, and the government is making that call, or inherently government, then that's why you want the liability protection. If you use the wrong numerical model, and, instead of hitting Venezuela, it hits New Orleans again. So, okay, who was, responsible for that? And so you don't want to go back to the individuals or the RA. So I guess I'm kind of rambling now. I do think there's a difference between what is inherently government and what isn't. And if that could be stated, I wasn't really, I was glad you read the non-federal asset because I didn't know what that really, the definition was. So I was glad you at least did that. So I think if you look at it from a criteria point of view, clearly if the RAs are going to do things that are inherently government, I'd say don't. And so, but then that whole criteria, though, if they are going to do functions that go back to there is a mirror in the federal government, then to me the easy thing would have been to use that criteria that the federal government was. Then comes the whole reality of fiscal. How much does it cost? And so I'd say if I wouldn't want the RAs not to do something, and I'm saying RAs, it could be whatever, that non-federal asset to do something or not do something only because it's costly. So, I think there has to be there's a fine line between, yes, you need funding to be able to do things adequately, but maybe you can't do everything as the feds, but yet that source of data is still good. So I guess I don't really have any kind of closing statement. It's just that, I mean, I've been sitting down here and I'm kind of going all over the place and thinking, no, please don't. So I was just trying to think of, your job is not it's not easy. And I think just some upfront defining maybe, okay, this is government, this is not. And I think clearly keep it at the RA level as opposed to the individual level. Try to get that worked out. If you are going to pick criteria and there's a mirror that you can take from the government or some international standard or, IEEE, ISO, ISO 9001 best practices, whatever, that's something that you can always, I think, say that's a good criteria and let's just go with that. I do think you need to move on. So with that,
that was very good. But you're hearing it, I think, Noah, a number of times. It's really desired to press on that clarity and reasonableness should be the hallmarks of the day. It seems that your comments reinforce that, and you're getting that kind of reinforcement from here. Certainly the RAs are what to be certified. Don't atomize it below that. The criteria that you can point to with standards should be pointed to. Mark and Landry did a nice job of that. The steps in the certification process, that probably can't be done here, but your working groups might be able to give you that. These are...
Brief comment. It's Manha Danak from Florida Atlantic University and a part of Sakura. I just wanted to say that, a lot of these non-federal assets, one of the issues is funding. To keep something in water for a long period of time requires funding. And so if you are going to certify something that can be used with the federal assets, on par with the federal assets, then it would require a corresponding support so that even though instruments may be out there for years and may be collecting data, to maintain them for future, investigators or individuals that maintain these assets do require some support. So if there was under this IU's umbrella, if there was designated support provided, then I think that will facilitate the certification process better so that you are funding what you certify as being an appropriate set of data.
Okay. After listening to Landry's comments, which are very good, if we go back to this. Is that what you call it? Well, maybe I shouldn't associate myself too much, but stimulating though. This issue about how do you go about trying to decide whether it's a federal role or not a federal role, and I take that into kind of the research operations and then also the difference between federal and state and local governments and what they're going to do now. And then I'm back to money. So let me try to connect that in a way that makes sense. When I ran the Navy's budget, I paid for GOMOOSE. And why did I pay for GOMOOSE in the Navy's budget? Because it was an earmark. And why was it an earmark? Because the people in New England thought this was a really good idea that should be helped by the federal government. And then, of course, when I got to NOAA, I found out I was paying for GOMOOSE too. And the Navy decided not to pay for GOMOOSE anymore, and so we paid for GOMOOSE. And GOMOOSE complained when they didn't get enough money because it was all earmarks, and everybody else was earmarking. We can go around Sura, and we can go around the coast all the way up to, Seattle, where we are today. And so, we eventually came across some kind of a system, which is a good one, I think. And my hat is off to everybody that put this in place with the regional associations. But the problem is we're not dealing with something that's very clear-cut and clean-cut. It is a partnership across a broad variety of entities that need the information and use it, in some cases, for different purposes. The federal government does need some of this information. Does the federal government want to know what's going on in fisheries in Georges Bank and the areas? Do they want to know what's happening in coastal erosion in places up along in New England? Yeah, just pick what they do. They want to know. They want to have that information. So there is some federal need for this, but there's also local need. So so you've got that problem. You've got to look at what that is. The next division is between operations and research, because it turns out that most of the people that are looking for help
in these associations are research institutes. Should a research institute be running an operational system that provides information to NDBC or NODC or our various information archives in the country, or not? And if they're going to do it, if they're going to do that, they should have some kind of criteria to meet, because the people who are running the models for the federal government have a law that says they're supposed to do this correctly, and so they've set up some kind of standards. And NOAA never liked to buy data. Now, this is sort of like buying data in a way, because you're getting it half price. So if you're going to buy data and get it half price, you ought to have some levels of standards. But you have to have the research that goes with it, because that's part of the seed corn of what we're doing. So when you look at it, do the entities that are in this game, and I don't think all of them want to run operational systems, as I'm on the board of SICORA, so I listen to what people say, but in a sense, they are running operational assets. So you're going to have to decide inside the regional association, inside of IUS, do you want to be an operational? Do you want to have an operational setup? And I went through this with the Ocean Observatories Initiative when John Delaney started that. Is that going to be an input and a function to an operational system, or is it simply an NSF research opportunity that goes on for whatever? Now it's 25 years, and then it quits because it just is a research project. But now, if you listen, Stenka has said it's the research input to what we're going to do with an ocean observing system. So the entities inside the RAs need to decide if they want to be engaged, if they're a big enough organization, because we can't have a whole system for research and then a whole system for operations. That doesn't make any sense. So we're back to that question of what is research, what is operations, and do the people inside these regional associations want to run it? And then they should be certified, and the data should be useful to the federal government, and then it's protected under liability. Anyway, that's it. Okay.
Just listening to the conversation, it sort of occurs to me that maybe there's still some thought or things that need to be worked out in terms of, what we envision the RA's role to be within IUS, and, thinking about the roadmap that's being developed and some of these other supporting documents like the maturity index, maybe kind of thinking about the development of those documents or processes in tandem with this, and thinking about how they can complement each other and work those issues out a bit more.
You referenced the roadmap, which we've been calling the USIU's roadmap to full capability. And that's been commented on and is still in that process with the interagency group, just so everybody knows what the reference was. If it's helpful, we or the subgroup has taken that into account. And when I mentioned before this idea of these working groups, how we got to that place was we took a look at the blueprint, which is I think what we've been calling it now, right? Am I backward? Right, blueprint. Roadmap is now blueprint, but we took a look at that and we looked at the functional groups that are called out in that document. And in that group, they talk about data partners, they talk about modeling, they talk about data collectors, they talk about governance entities. It lists, I think there are 9, I want to say. Anyhow, there's a number of those folks. And when we took a hard look at those groups and said, all right, who in this list could warrant certification if we're going to try to make sure we're using a collective set of thought here. And as we looked at the list, what bubbled up to the top and seemed to make sense, as we've all talked about today, was both the data partners, data collectors element of that, and also the governance entity element, which according to the Act is using the term RAs and RICEs. So I only offer that as it's a good point, and we have been considering that document as a part of this whole quest for certification as well.
And I would just add that document is still going through review, but once adopted, it is included in the list of background material that either the governance or the data group would need to consider.
I've kind of taken a pass on number 4, other than I would think that a possible distillation of number 4 might be that whatever that process might be, it should in fact be reasonable. It should be clear, and it should not be overly burdensome from a bureaucratic or administrative standpoint. This thing could be killed by bureaucracy, and it could be, we could die in minutia if we're not careful. So I would hope that that does not happen to number 4. And Josie also has a comment on number 4.
Picking up on what Dave just said, I think if you look at the act, it actually says that it could be, these things can be certified by certification or contract or other kind of language. And you may want to, once again, think about the regional entities as one way, but then I think a lot of data management, data standards can often be due through a contract process. So every year, you've got these ongoing contracts with the regional associations, and that could be looked at as a possible vehicle for ensuring that. Because I agree with Dave, if this could be just so complicated, it could just use up all the resources at the national level and the regional level, and we would never get to really what we're all trying to get to. So I would encourage looking at those kind of things.
I haven't heard it explicitly said, but an easy element to evaluate, and it ties into 4 and 5 as well, is the past performance of RAs and the ability to keep sensors up. Data buoy, co-ops, CBIBs are all fixated on percentages of uptime. And if you evaluated that, it's useful. It also ties in, it all comes back to the money and the cost of maintaining these things. It's sexy to buy a very good instrument and deploy it. It's not so much maintaining it year after year.
So true. So true. 1, 2, 3, and 4. At least you get some nice input on number 4, and I think you can take that as a consensus. Pretty.
Consensus is so easy.
Okay, it's unanimous. Okay. Number 5, how often should entities be required to be certified? Josie just mentioned that we in fact do go through a review process. We have the progress reports, which are submitted now by the various RAs on this. This could be another simple one. It could be, in fact, as often as whenever a contract is renewed, there could be periodic reviews. I think that what you want to do, because number 5 really is a workload on the federal government, assuming that the federal government is going to be the certifying authority. I don't think that you want to be in a constant process of recertification every quarter or every 6 months or even every year. That'd be a dozen a year you're talking about here. That's probably too many. I think that you want to rely on reports. I think that you want to rely on recertification or as Mark's mentioned, the past performance of good judgment, of reasonableness, of best practices as part of that recertification process, and controlled by what I will say is negativity. You have failed in this, so we're going to revoke that certification. And that's going to happen very, very seldom, I would think. Hold on, let me get to Dick Kraut.
Dick Kraut again. I guess the point that I was looking at there is if we do rely on reports, then we're putting the burden back on the regional associations again, kind of, for them to generate reports and things. And it seems with data, it should be so easy, for those reports to be generated automatically. At a federal level, if their data are coming through co-ops or NDBC or somebody, or at the regional level. So I think those things, when we think about it, I think we should really point that those have to be automated rather than putting another burden on the RAs to have to come up with a process.
Excellent point, Dick. I agree totally. The one area where those probably can't be automated is the other areas called out in the Act, research and development and education, and all your RAs already report on that and have substantive effort in there as part of the national schema to generate an informed constituency or population such that both the federal and the regional roles in the federal missions can in fact be accomplished most efficiently. The point that Admiral Lautenbacher was making on that. Man. Okay. Any comments here? We've gone 1 through 5. My compliments to you all in the audience and to the discussion leaders, but we're not done. Jan?
Provoked comments, so I actually thought of one myself. you know, when you think about how to certify education outreach, our brains just kind of numb, but maybe it's not, you know, like, you know, are you doing it on this topic or that topic, but it's more how you're doing it. You know, are you engaging stakeholders? Is your outreach effort providing a two-way communication? So, I mean, I think you could ask some, you know, are you utilizing the NANUS data in your, you know, are you providing training? You could develop some questions that are more certifying the approach as opposed to the, you know, oh yeah, you know, that tutorial, I didn't understand it. You don't want to be certifying that sort of thing, but rather the approach. And I think that could be readily done.
Yeah, I had a comment that kind of touches on both 4 and 5, and it gets to, I guess, the difference between a certification of say, an association versus the certification of the data. The two components, but have very different views, at least the way I look at it. You have different functions and you have different regional characteristics. So I guess for some flexibility in the way you would be looking at the process or outcomes. And a lot of that, I guess, could go back to what some of their directives internally are and goals, and you can get to things such as education and everything. If they're meeting some of those types of very specific things that they have laid on the table for their long-term efforts. So the ability to do that and use some of the capabilities or some of the directives that are already being built within the associations. To time-wise, I would think, again, that kind of separates to some degree. The reporting capabilities could be on the more on specifically the programs, the data collection. On the certification of the entities, I would think be on a longer scale, 5-year time frame or something like that. So you allow those organizations to mature and go further, and then I'm sure there'll be more guidance further on how they can go, you know, maybe other things that really weren't thought about in the initial round of the certification process.
We're down to our final minute. I want to save some short time for our leaders up here to have any final comments. Is there anything final before I turn it over to NOAA and COL? Excellent. Nice job, folks. Let the record show that the moderator never used coercion or strong-arm tactics to get input. And it was all voluntary, and it's yours.
Thank you for the input. We appreciate it. I think the group appreciates it. The working groups will certainly appreciate it when it comes time to actually sit down and write some of this stuff. I would note 2 things. As you're leaving, like I said, there are handouts by the door. There's space on the back of that if you have epiphanies later and there are things you want to include or make sure that we take into account. There's space on the back to include that information, as well as I think email address. So continue to send things if you have moments of clarity later that didn't happen in this room. And also, as I mentioned before, there's a Federal Register notice inviting the same comment on these questions and other things. That list is certainly not exhaustive. That should be going out, like I said, today, tomorrow, hopefully very, very soon. And we'll make sure to try to send that around as well and have that posted on the IU's website if you're so inclined. So on that note, thank you very much for joining us today.